Welcome back to the CNBC Africa broadcast, coming to you live from Addis Ababa, where the World Economic Forum is currently in session. Our focus this afternoon is, of course, the challenge of market integration on the African continent. Ngozi, I'm coming back to you on this in terms of the convertibility of currencies on the African continent. Is that something that is in the pipeline and certainly on the horizon in the near future?
Well, I think that it's an aspiration we have, and beyond aspiration, I think we've been working towards it in the West African sub-region. But my belief is that in order to have this kind of convertibility, you really need to do quite a bit of work within countries. I mean, if you go to a common currency, and you have, by the way, you have among a group of West African countries, the CFA franc, which is already convertible, traded, used, and it has its own issues, but I think it's one that we can at least see and savor the experience and learn from it. But moving towards a common convertible currency, I think requires strong economic actions behind borders. So I think until, we are very sure in terms of our macroeconomic stability and some of the needed structural reforms that really underpin strong economies, I think we should move, but move with caution and do all that is necessary. And you have seen what happens when in a common currency zone, as we're looking at the Eurozone now, when some members are not quite as strong as others, or the statistics is not right. And then it becomes a contagion that spreads to the whole zone and can really have the debilitating economic impact. So I think we need to learn our lessons and take our time so that when and if we do that, we do it properly.
Praveen, do you agree with Ngozi on this front that we should hold back on the notion of a convertible currency for Africa?
Yes. In particular, there's a live drama going on in front of us every single day called the euro. And there's lots of lessons, and that's an important historical experiment. Many years from now, we'll learn the lessons of what worked and what didn't work. On a mini scale, we have a rand monetary area, very similar to the West African situation, where there is this sharing of the rand. But far more important, perhaps, in our context would be trade financing. And doing trade financing in a way in which we could begin to use some of our own African currencies. Now, an interesting experiment amongst the BRICS countries is local currency trading. In this instance, using the renminbi, if you're trading, for example, with China. Now, can we do more of that so that another problem that we also have in the globe, which is the problems that arise from a reserve currency like the dollar. And when that central bank decides they are going to do QE X, Y, and Z, it has significant impacts on other economies as well. But one country and one central bank can determine the fate of many parts of the world as a result of decisions that they actually make. So our world is transitioning in a million different ways to a different set of models. Hopefully most of us live to see some of those. But these things happen very gradually, and over time we'll learn where we make mistakes and where not to tread. And certainly Ngozi is right. This area, let's be treading very, very carefully.
John, before we move off the currency debate, what's happening in the East African community? Aren't you quite far down the track on this front?
Yeah, thank you. I think, as my colleague said, we have this ambition of creating a monetary union with one currency. Of course, with the experience of Europe today, we are being a bit conscious on that. But what we are doing, there are other achievements, or there are other added value we can have before even create this single currency. So we are integrating our financial markets, and so easier to trade across the region. Today, when we have an IPO in Kigali, a Tanzanian or a Kenyan or a Ugandan will subscribe to this IPO as a domestic investor, not as an international investor. But also the ease of doing business between investors in the two countries creating the ease of transfer of resources. The fact that we have banks that are established across the region, that also eases trade across the region. So, in short, we had an ambitious target of establishing a monetary union this year, 2012. So we think it's not possible, but we've given ourselves a target that by the end of this year we'll have a protocol for the establishment of this monetary union with clear timelines of what has to be done, how we converge our economies, and how we strengthen the common market. As we strengthen the common market, as we have a fully functional customs union, then it will be easier to move to a monetary union. So we are on track, we are moving on that, but as I said, as my colleague said, we are a bit cautious and trying to create a homogeneous environment across the countries before we move on to a single currency.
Eleni, you want to add
I
there?
just want to jump. I'd like to just jump in on this point about the currency because, you know, markets are very pragmatic. So if you've ever sat in a border market, and I spent a lot of my earlier career looking at border trade at borders, and what you see is next to the people going back and forth on bicycle between Uganda and Kenya or any other border, including many places I've been, you see also somebody with a wad of cash holding, you know, some Ugandan shillings and Kenyan shillings and running a currency market. So I fully agree that maybe the first best world is to have one, you know, humongous currency, but I don't think that's really the issue. The real issue is whether we can create those currency markets that that Pravin was talking about, that whether we can make it easy through regional banks or Pan-African banks to convert these currencies between countries, even maintaining our national currencies.
Ngozi coming, yes, you want to add, Erasmus?
Yeah, I think sequencing regional integration and getting your priorities right is very important. Going for a single currency is not something I would put as a front burner when it comes to regional integration. But there are issues that you need to address, because why you need single currency, you are essentially dealing with issue of convertibility, cost of doing business. Because at the moment, if you are doing business in Africa and you have a transaction between country and B, confirmation of letters of credit takes place in New York or elsewhere. Now that costs money. Yeah. And it also affects trade. But there are schemes that you can use to overcome this challenge. Exactly. Things like payment schemes. And I know, for instance, in Eastern and Southern Africa, certainly under COMESA, they are now working on a payment. It used to be there, working very well. So currency convertibility is something you want to bring later on, as John and Ngozi and others have said. When you have economies that are disciplined, that are moving towards macroeconomic stability, that you can be sure that you don't have a serious problem of a contention that would develop. Now, in Europe at the moment, many people are saying it's not a euro crisis. It is really a problem of macroeconomic discipline at the national level, statistics and the rest, that is a problem. So I think we can throw out the baby with the bathwater, saying it is a currency problem, but the problem being at the national level.
Well, let's focus on this intra-Africa trade. Ngozi currently sitting at around 10%. At a push, if you include informal trade, cross-border, sitting at about 20%. Now that compares, and I know we don't want to benchmark against Europe with all its problems right now. I think that point has been made very clear this afternoon. But Europe's intertrade falls in at about 60%, North America at 40%, and you're sitting with Asia at around 30%. So we are seriously lagging right now. So what is it that we need? Is it this cross-border, or do we need trade finance institutions which focus specifically on regional trade on the African continent, on cross-border payment systems, all those kind of elements?
Yeah, well, you talked about both the formal level, where about, is it about 10%?
About 10%.
But informally, if we could really measure the huge amount of informal trade, because we lament a lot, but let me tell you, our people are far more integrated. Goods are moving all the time on the heads of people carried across when they can't get the lorry. And so I believe we should really study the cross-border informal flows. And if we had a way to measure them and to learn the lessons of how to enable this, we would be going somewhere. So I believe that trade is happening to a much larger extent. But it is important that it be formal, you know, formalized if we can. At least those people support it, because as long as it's informal, you know, they cannot have access to the proper means of financing to increase that and so on. Now, my strong belief is that for me, I would say the first thing that we need to look at is the logistics. If we can begin to solve the logistical problems and remove the numerous checkpoints along the road that you encounter, and even within our own borders, we also have national checkpoints, so we start with ourselves. Start with then, inculcate this mentality of being able to move and drive freely. That will really, the same way that the other day, as I was saying to Praveen, now we're going to Cote d'Ivoire. In the past, somebody joined our delegation at the last minute, literally. In the past, it could not have been possible because they didn't have a visa. This time, you could jump in, just take your passport and make it. When we make those corrections and goods can move, we can uptrade. The second more difficult problem is the nature of the commodities we trade. And the point is that most of us are selling the same commodities. We have no specialization in terms of what we do in our economies. So most of us grow the same things, we trade the same things, and so on and so forth. So one of the deeper things that I think we need to look at is there a way, you know, looking at our comparative advantages, you know, where we can, you know, somehow be a little more specialized so that if a country is focusing on X crops, for instance, I mean, you grow everything, but maybe you do much more of one. In West Africa, I think everything that our neighbors can produce genuinely within their countries, we can absorb. We always say that. But, you know, so if we had a bit more specialization, I think it would also encourage trade.
John, Erasmus, you want to add there?
I wanted to jump in and largely agree with Ngozi, but deal with one aspect which I think is a perception. Personally, I've really been confronting, and she rightly mentioned that we lament a lot, and we also sometimes are skeptical for things that are not necessarily true. Now, there is a lot of complementarity in Africa, in the African economies, that is perhaps less talked about. Now, even if you talked about the agricultural commodities that we produce, and take each one of them, start even with tea. Now, one of the things, as I gave an example, in my previous incarnation, I realized, of course, that even, say, within COMESA, you could have huge trade in tea, but somebody would be thinking that in Africa, everybody produces tea, which is a kind of perception that is not true. I mean, Egypt doesn't produce tea, but perhaps Kenya produces tea, Sudan doesn't produce tea, but Kenya produces tea, and you can see that trade going on. And even if you took some of the commodities, say like maize, seasons alone, even within a country, you will find one season perhaps gets rain in January, another one in June. You can have seasonal trade, but also that's why you need mechanisms that can assist this trade. So it's not, to me, yes, you need to go to specialization, but the most important thing is what Ngozi said. How do we facilitate trade? And the facilitation also requires a paradigm shift in our mind. Our economies have always been thinking trade must be north-south, commodity must move north-south. If you look, our infrastructure is north-south, meaning port to inland. We need to change this and realize that if we have to benefit from the population dividend, there is a lot we can do in the continent, and these economies will grow faster the moment Africa starts to trade with itself, and that is certainly possible.
Praveen, perhaps one of the keys to that is communication. There's situations where we find some African countries are importing from outside the continent when actually one of their neighboring countries is producing that very good. If we had better communication flow, that could be a great starting point for us.
Well, in addition to the hard infrastructure, we now need soft infrastructure. So why can't we start focusing on developing African brands? developing better marketing, which is communications mechanisms on the continent? Why does tea from Kenya have to go somewhere else to be given a fancy brand and then bought at a spectacularly fancy price as well? So all of us in this world have become brand conscious. Now, can't we become brand conscious about African products and promote African brands? It'll throw up its own dynamics and challenges, I'm sure, but culturally we're still dominated by the perception that brands coming from particular geographies are the best in the world. I'm sure you can get best in the breed, best of breed from the African continent as well. So the soft infrastructure is going to be as important as the hard infrastructure as well. And again, it requires institutions, it requires the right level of cooperation. I've used this phrase elsewhere, let me use it again. We need a cooperative competition. We need to learn where to cooperate and we need to learn where to compete. Right now, we want to compete on everything and cooperate on very little, although we're making all these efforts. If we increase the cooperation part of that duo, there's huge dividends to be gained. And the flip side of this, of course, is that we need to create demand on the African continent. And demand on the African continent comes from jobs and comes from people having income in their pockets. So that dynamic has to flow together with the other dynamic that we're talking about in relation to integration as well.
Eleni, this softer touch point, made in Africa, buy in Africa.
Absolutely.
Are you forging ahead on the Ethiopian
Absolutely.
Commodity Exchange on that front?
Absolutely, absolutely. I think that's where we're all headed. But you know, the thing is that agreeing with what was said earlier about the logistics, very, very critical. But you know, where trade is happening, formal trade, it's because trade itself is promoting specialization. So it's not necessarily that we need specialization to have trade, but rather when you let trade happen, sometimes organically, those who are less good at certain things shy away from it, easier place they can get it. So I know, for example, that there's a lot of maize and beans from Ethiopia in Kenya. And that's because we have, you know, seasonal surpluses and potentially more productivity in some parts of the country. So it might be that we will be importing other goods, maybe industrialized goods or other manufactured things from Kenya while we are exporting the maize in the first instance, and then we'll see these things organically change. So I think get those borders open and let's focus on both the hard infrastructure and the soft infrastructure.
Ngozi.
Yeah, I just wanted to raise another issue that we should also be cognizant of. We have in the West Africa region the common external tariff, yes, which is actually very good, you know, and you know, so we have a common book with some exceptions that allow us to protect some of the industries we want to encourage. And we've all signed up to this and are trying to do it. But we have certain challenges in this trade. Our promise is that if something is produced in a particular country, it can move freely at very low tariffs. But what we're seeing increasingly is goods produced elsewhere, brought in bulk, let's say palm oil, from Malaysia, or typically textiles or goods from China. They are brought in, they are repackaged, you know, and rebranded in a particular country, and then it's said that it is made there. And then it's brought into and it's a real challenge. You know, so so let us also look at some of the issues that are arising from this trade, because for us it's a very big problem and, you know, departs from the rule. And of course, you know, our people and the other people are going into this breach and trying to exploit it. So if we're going to have this kind of trade and the freedom for our goods to move freely, they must genuinely, it must be genuine intra-African trade, not goods made elsewhere that are just rebranded and sent across the border.
Yes. Let's bring in another theme here. While we're talking about hard and soft, do you think that we are moving from hard sovereignty to soft sovereignty on the African continent? And is that absolutely crucial when it comes to talking about the integration of this continent? John. Sorry, Ngozi. John and Erasmus, if we can take up after that.
I think at the end of the day, when we talk of sovereignty, what does it mean? I think all, as governments and I'm sure as nationals of our countries, what's important is what benefits us in terms of improving our lives, in terms of improving our development. So fighting for sovereignty when you remain poor and you remain backward, I don't think that makes any sense. I think what we are doing, and I'm happy that we are here as officials from different governments talking as one, as all having interest to have Africa move as one continent. So when we think of that, I think the issue of sovereignty doesn't really matter here. Because at the end of the day, what do these borders mean anyway? When most of our borders are just artificial borders because the citizens themselves who live across borders, they don't consider, they don't give value to this border. They visit each other, they intermarry, and it's... So from the political side, when we start thinking like these citizens across our borders, and we just think what is beneficial to us as one continent, I think that's the most important thing. So sovereignty, yes, but sovereignty for what purpose? I think the most important thing is what do we need to do as a continent? Today we talk of global village, so why can't we talk of one continent as one village and do what is beneficial to us as one continent, not really as individual states, because we can't survive as individual states. It doesn't make sense at all.
Erasmus, let's get your African Union voice in on this one.
Integration is a process and it's a time-consuming because it's very slow. And when you look at the national level, a politician is got a short-term view because they have a next election to win. And that means aspects that may not deliver quickly will not be in the priority of the national dialogue or ex-country. But as John is saying, when we all start realizing that these borders, at the end of the day, make us less effective, and we see that pulling our sovereignty, rather than talking of losing it, but pulling it, makes us stronger. And that change, you can see starting to take root. And if you look at the aspects like peace and security, all countries now realize that we are talking of let's create an ECOMOG, let's create by force. Now, who would be the commander? It's not the head of state. It would mean somebody else. That's sovereignty you are already setting. We are talking of creating an African court with jurisdiction to do some of the things that are done at the national level. That is ceding sovereignty. We are talking of an Pan-African parliament. Now, but the only, it is a slow, but at the end of the day, when we realize, for instance, if we speak on climate change, go to the WTO. Praveen was talking about the African solidarity again behind Ngozi. If it was only Nigeria, nobody would listen. But if it was Africa, everybody was listening. And they know that Africa has made a statement. And so Africa, we need to work together. We need to talk together. That's when Africa will have a place on the global table.
Thank you, Erastus. Praveen, we haven't got much time left. We've got to talk about power and the pooling of power resources as part of keeping this continent going. SADC has been forging ahead on that front. What is happening? Is it working? And can it be deployed across the African continent?
I think there's some experts in the audience that are better qualified to talk about this. But yes, there's some progress, and there's been sort of power sharing. For example, Kahara Basa power coming into South Africa and other states. Today, Botswana is talking about coal-fired power stations in Botswana, where they could serve themselves and serve other states as well. The biggest hope for much of Africa is the Inga project. And that's the one that's been testing all of us. There's hope and huge potential in that project, but great hesitancy in moving forward for all sorts of reasons. And projects like that begin to test hard sovereignty and soft sovereignty. They begin to test whether, once you see an opportunity, there's the institutions and the legal and other frameworks which will enable us to capitalize on that. If we see some of those initiatives, it will make a huge difference. But generally, I think there's a move towards an understanding that we require regional and continental power grids, that we can't do everything on a country-based basis, that power sharing in the electrical sense, not in the political sense, is going to be an important component of our collective survival. And we're all learning in different ways. We certainly are learning it in South Africa, that if you don't plan power sustainability on an adequate basis and on a 10, 20-year scenario, not through election cycles, we'll find ourselves in trouble. And those lessons, I think, are being borne in mind. What we require, though, is the right kind of utilities across the continent that then have, if you like, an African Union framework, which will enable them to cooperate, to share, to make investment decisions on a planned basis, all of which I think can be done.
We've got 2 minutes before we close up on the broadcast, so perhaps I can quickly get you all to think, if I said to you that African integration has been put to the top of your agenda, John, you are in charge, and everybody in turn, what is the one thing that you are going to push very hard in the short term to achieve Africa market integration? John?
I think number one is infrastructure that links our countries, then breaking all these barriers along these corridors. I think that's very key. Thank you.
Ngozi?
Logistics.
Erastus?
Infrastructure trade.
Praveen, you're going to have to give me, everyone's hospital passes to you. You're going to give me at least 20 seconds, otherwise we're going to be ending this broadcast early.
No, it's an infrastructure linked to some practical successes. So, for example, the triple FTA. Let's make it work, and let's make it work sooner rather than later, and show that integration projects can actually succeed.
Eleni, you've got a whole 1 minute to cover in terms of if you were at the head of the Africa Integration Committee.
No, I think the first thing I would say is that we need to follow what is already being done and make that informal logic easier, facilitate it, enable it to grow, and foster it so that it really becomes the basis for scaling up. So, and to do that, it's about hard infrastructure, roads, logistics, transport fleets, but it's also about information flows, connecting people, grades and standards, financing across borders. So these kind of things, I think, will let that informal sector grow into something really exciting.
Ladies and gentlemen, a round of applause for my esteemed panelists. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon.